what you get is a kind of clumsy to read description of the story.
Hi, I'm Chaz Fisher.
And I'm Stu Willis.
And welcome to Draft Zero, a podcast where today we are not talking about what makes great screenplays work, but rather how to make a great screenplay that works, or rather the process behind it.
Yeah, we are doing part 2 of our short document series with Stephen Cleary. And Stephen will go into detail, and we've recorded this already, so we're talking in the past tense. Stephen will go into great detail in what he has been calling the Story Synopsis, which is actually a document focused on theme. As he will explain, but it's worth saying right up front, the Story Synopsis is a short document that retells the story, so it's related to your synopsis, retells your story in really bold, obvious, non-subtle terms about the theme.
Yeah. I mean, it helps you figure out what your story is about, not,
what happens.
Yeah, exactly. Separate to the plot. Or rather, how does the plot dramatize what your story is about?
Yeah, what I was going to say is it actually helps you work out what is the meaning behind what happens.
Yeah. Well, and as we'll go into, it's going to be, I think, a document that's not just a great short document for development, but a rewriting tool as well.
And spoilers abound for the classic 1986 film Witness, Stephen is going to continue using as a primary example.
Well, it made you go back and rewatch Witness, and now after listening to it, I really want to watch Witness. So hopefully we can all go back and enjoy some classic Harrison Ford action.
Nice. So, Stephen, I'd like to get into some more detail about this mysterious story synopsis document.
The Story Synopsis is an interesting document. And I would say a pretty critical one. And in a way, it marks, or it's an important staging point on the transition from using short documents to kind of evolve your own idea of what the story is and to help you understand it yourself as the writer. And those to move that notion of the story towards documents which are about selling the story to others. And it's important because the essential thing about a story synopsis document is it's really about theme, and it's the only document that is primarily interested in exploring the theme of the story as opposed to the plot or the characters or whatever. So when you say synopsis, you're normally talking in terms of, a synopsis of the story, which is a précis, a shortened version of the story. And when you're thinking of précis and shortened versions, you're normally really talking about that becomes a kind of plot document. So a standard synopsis or an outline is kind of to do with it's about the organization of plot, and how do I, in a shorter space, lay out the plot in a concentrated form for the reader. Whereas before you get to that, or indeed after you get there, but how exactly where you do it is really up to you. But I think you have to do it before you do a treatment, because ideally you do this in order to prepare yourself for the treatment.
So how is the story synopsis different from these other documents?
Yeah, look, it's the document that you write where you're asking the same question. Okay, I've got my plot, I've got my characters, I've got a kind of story summary, I've got a standard synopsis. But how do I clarify for myself what the theme of the story is? Okay, how do I, if I think I know what I'm trying to do, if I know, I say, no, I think the underlying meaning of my story is this, then how do I get a document going that kind of can help me see if that's clear and working and through the script? Okay. So it might be that at a certain point in the story, you've got your theme working quite well, but at another point, it might start to disappear. It might start to fade away. There's a 20-page or 30-page section where thematically it kind of loses touch with the theme. So it's becoming disconnected, as it were. Your Praxis and Mythos are not, tied together anymore.
Praxis and Mythos, what?
There's a kind of practical way to think about it, and there's also this theoretical way to think about it. And it's worth thinking about the theoretical basis of this kind of thinking, not just in terms of short documents, but about thinking about your story. And as usual, I would go back to Aristotle about this, because Aristotle, as in so many things, kind of nailed these ideas for the first time, and in a really clear way. Aristotle talked about the praxis of a story, and that's the kind of action. It means of action or events. And that's kind of what we say as the plot, the praxis of the story, the action of the story. But he also has this other idea of story, which is related to it, which is called mythos. And the mythos of a story is something deeper. And in his idea of tragedy, the mythos, which is the true underlying pattern of the story. If you think of what a story is, it's like literally hundreds of things that happen in a story, thousands even.
The chain of cause and effect, is that what you're thinking of, and how the events that come out of that?
Kind of, but as any story is hundreds of things that are happening because of things that happened before. But if you think of a tragic hero, for example, in a story, at the end of the story, example I would always use is Macbeth, because it's my favorite example. At the end of Macbeth, when he stands and says, there's a speech he gives, which is very famous.
Tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death.
All our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. That's the critical line in his understanding. Now, a fool in Elizabethan English is a candle. So when he says all my yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death, he's kind of saying, if I look backwards, every day that I have lived is like a candle lit, and I can see that line of candles that goes all the way back to my beginnings. And I now understand that those candles are a path that have led me here to face my imminent death. Okay, so what he's kind of saying is, I'm now looking back and I can see the entire pattern of my life. Only now can I look back and do that. So it hasn't been possible until now. And this is a critical moment for the tragic hero. The reason it's a tragedy is not that he dies. The reason it's a tragedy is because he realizes just before he dies that he could have done something different. That's why it's tragedy. This tragedy comes from the sense of loss and the sense of disappointment. It's not the fact that he dies that makes it tragic. It's the fact that he could have not died, but he didn't know enough to stop it. That's what a tragedy is. It has a sense of loss and of missed opportunity, and all things that could have been will no longer be because of what I was.
And the character realizing that,
the character realizing that's what makes it critical in tragedy. Now, what we're talking about here is, if you look at, as it were, those lighted candles, that path the character has been on. In the story we've seen, the character has done thousands and thousands of things. Have taken, as I sort of say, praxis. There's been an enormous amount of, as it were, events in their life. But certain events were the events the decisions he took that led him to this inevitable doom. Okay, only certain events. Out of the thousands and thousands of events, they weren't all candles. Only a few were candles. That decision, and that decision, and that decision, and those were the critical decisions. Okay, so and that in Aristotle's thinking is the mythos. It's the underlying meaning of the pattern of events in a story. Okay, so you have a story with thousands of events, and there is an underlying meaning. And so when the character looks back, he kind of goes, if I look at my life as a story, I understand the meaning of it now. I've thought that I was a heroic king. In fact, I'm a fool. The real meaning of my life, the real meaning of my story is now apparent. Now, think of when you put a story down. You read a novel, or you watch a screenplay, or you watch a TV series, and it's finished. Okay, and you say, Chernobyl. Okay, there's what Chernobyl is about, which is it's about the explosion of a nuclear power station, and a man is tasked with the job of both stopping it and finding out, what happened and why it happened. Okay, so that's, as it were, the surface meaning of Chernobyl,
or the praxis,
yeah. And then you say, what's it really about? And it's and what Chernobyl is really about is a set of universal values that are struggling to survive within an oppressive political system, that are to do with decency and friendship and your own kind of sense of moral justice, if you like. Now, you can argue as to whether that's what Chernobyl is about. That's an argument about theme. I think it's about this. You go, no, I think it's about that. But the point is that decision that we're making to talk about Chernobyl in that way is we're saying, okay, we know what the praxis of Chernobyl is. What's the mythos? What, having got to the end and looking back at the organized pattern of events, what's the deeper underlying meaning of the story?
Yeah. Okay.
And that's what people mean when they say the theme. When they say, what's the theme of your story? What they mean is, I've read the script. I know what the plot is. I've read it. I understand it. I know the characters. But what I'm interested in now is what your script is really about. Not what happens in it, which is Praxis related, but what it's really about, the deeper meaning that is only understood by looking back and having an organized understanding of those things in the story that were more significant than other things. And again, Aristotle divides action into action and significant action. So he says you can look at any story and there's lots of things that happen, but of those, if you say, okay, how many plot events do I have in my script? Okay, I have 187 plot events. Okay, 13 of those are the most significant ones. Those are the critical ones. However, number is not important. Aristotle said, again, you can look at any story and you can say, these are the plot events, but what you're actually really looking for are the significant plot events. And those are significant because they are critical to the mythos, critical to laying out the deeper underlying meaning of the story, which only becomes apparent to us when we are looking at the story in its entirety, and which we would call, for ease of access and ease of use, the theme, the deeper underlying truth that the story exemplifies.
Mm. So how does that relate to the story synopsis?
So the story synopsis document is simply a document that explores theme. It retells the events of the story, the plot, if you like. It retells the events of the story in terms of the theme. Okay, so now when you write the script, what you want the reader to do is when they put the script down, they go, I know what this film is about and I know what it's really about. I understand they're going to plot. I understand the thematic underpinning of the plot. So this document is about trying to find a way of getting at that underlying meaning. So it's to understand find out if that underlying meaning is clear and evolving throughout the story and how it evolves. So you're going to write a short description of the events of the story, the plot of the story, in terms of the theme. You see what I mean? So you're going to, this is where it begets. So you have to take, and I'm going to use the example I always use is Witness.
Yeah.
Is the way that, because we talked about Witness before. So it's the difference, really, to be clear about it. It's the difference between what happens in your story and what the story is about. The plot synopsis document is really about, the story synopsis is about exploring this question, what is the story about? Not so much what happens. You should kind of have a good idea of what happens.
But also making sure, I guess the impression I'm getting, it's pretty easy for me as a writer to go write a document that says, this is what the story is about. Thematically, I am telling a metaphor about whatever it is. Yeah. Crime is everywhere, to come back to that. But this sounds like it's more forensic in terms of examining how you're expressing that theme on the page.
Absolutely through the story. So the idea of this kind of document is that ideally, when you finish your script, the person reading it puts it down. If they're talking about writing the script as opposed to making the film, puts the script down and goes, "That's amazing. I understood exactly what happened in the story, and I know what the story is really about. It's really about this." And then if you said, "Okay, well, how do you mean it's really about that?" And you say, "Well," they would then say to you, "Well, it kind of starts here. This idea is kind of raised, and through the middle, it's taken this way and that way, and then kind of resolves here." So it's not just, "Oh, I understand the theme," and as a kind of static statement. They say, "I understand the theme. I understand how it's played with."
Okay.
I can describe to you from reading the script how you take that theme and you evolve it through the story. So that's what this document is about, is trying to work out the evolution of the theme rather than just state it, which is a simple thing. It's kind of more complex way of doing it.
So how does that look? So yeah, how does that look in the context of Witness?
Hey, man.
They didn't know there was a witness.
Carter didn't tell me about the eyewitness.
Yeah, Amish kid, 8 years old.
A man of force.
I'm a police officer, ma'am. I have to talk to the boy.
A woman of faith.
You don't understand. We have nothing to do with your laws.
Yes, I do. Your son's a material witness to a homicide.
Worlds apart.
Now you have a witness.
Yeah, now I got a witness.
Witness.
In Witness, let's look at if you have a log line, just now I'm going to exaggerate the log line and stretch it out a little bit. This is a log line of Witness. Okay, so the log line of Witness that we're going to use is, and again, I'm not saying necessarily I believe this is true about Witness. I'm using it as an illustration, but it shows you what I mean.
John Book, a good cop, must protect a young Amish boy who has witnessed a murder. He retreats with the boy to Amish country, where he has to adjust to life with the Amish and his feelings for the boy's mother. John Book's relationship with the Amish allows him to defeat the killers when they arrive, but once his work is done, he must leave his new life and the mother behind.
Okay, so it's quite slightly long and not kind of as punchy a log line as you might expect. But I'm stretching it out in order to show it's as much as kind of a short summary of the story. Okay, so what that log line tells us is that the central character is John Book, and the bald plot of the story is the kid running to the Amish, getting along with the Amish one way or another. The bad guy's coming back, and his relationship with the Amish is what allows him to defeat. So it's who the character is, what happens to him, how they do it. Okay, so that's, as it were, a log line of Witness. Then you'd say, okay, let's make a thematic statement about Witness. So what do I think Witness is really about? That, you know, the log line we just talked about gives us the summary of the story in microcosm. Now I want to make a thematic statement about the theme. Now, again, the point to understand is that I don't really mind or care if you agree or disagree with this thematic idea of what I think Witness is about. Okay, I'm using it for purposes of illustration. So let's say, and let's not get into a big discussion about whether it's actually true. Okay, let's say what Witness is really about, as opposed to what happens in it, which is what we just dealt with the logline. What Witness is really about is this.
Witness is a story of one man's quest to reconcile conflicting opposites in his life and find peace.
Okay, that's what I think Witness is really about for purposes of this discussion. Okay, so my thematic statement is, now, ideally, I write Witness, the screenplay, I give it to my friend or my producer or whoever, and my producer says, that's really great. Really, Witness is a story of one man's quest to reconcile conflicting opposites in his life and find peace. And I go, yes, exactly. Okay, so that's what we're hoping, the underlying thematic meaning of the reconciliation of opposites in one man's life is what the story is really about.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're using the world of Witness in order to tell that story.
Which is great, but what we're doing here is analyzing Witness. That's not necessarily helping Stu, myself, our listeners go, oh, I want to try and use this document to better understand the theme and how the theme is dramatized in my own work. So how do we do that?
Okay, so what we're doing now for your story, when you're writing your story synopsis, this is the first thing you have to find. Okay, you have to write for yourself this kind of short sentence, which is a thematic summary of what the story is about for you. Okay, now, so you say, what is my story really about? Okay, and it's the things to remember in that statement that you're writing. Then look at when this is a story of one man's quest to reconcile the opposites in his life and find peace. There needs to be within that sentence that you write the sense of a possibility of a journey or a movement. Okay, so if you write Witness is about the impossibility of truth, okay, that's kind of a statement. It doesn't have implicit in the sentence the idea of movement and evolution. Okay, you see what I mean? It's you're not looking for a thematic statement. You're looking for a thematic kind of description. And within that description, thematically, there has to be the idea of movement. What in my sentence, the idea of movement is given by the words, the story of one man's quest to reconcile. Okay, so that means Witness thematically is about a man who is struggling with this thing, the quest to reconcile. He's on a quest to reconcile. It doesn't say Witness is about reconciling opposites. Okay.
Yes.
Even though even within the sentence reconciling opposites, there's a little suggestion of movement. But my sentence in itself contains the possibility of evolution. So when you write your thematic, another favorite film of mine, Lawrence of Arabia. Okay, if you talk about Lawrence of Arabia thematically, there's a great line at the beginning of Lawrence of Arabia where he's in a scene where Lawrence is in an office in Alexandria in a cellar, and he keeps putting a match out with his fingers, and the guy says, a guy tries to do it himself and he burns his fingers. And he says,
"Oh, it damn well hurts."
And Lawrence replies,
"Certainly it hurts." "Well, what's the trick then?"
"The trick, William Potter, is not minding that it hurts."
Okay, and that for me is a thematic statement of the entire film. It's one of these things that writers do every now and then. Early in the film, the writer tells the audience what the story is about, even though the audience doesn't get it. And so, the story of Lawrence of Arabia is, for me, what is Lawrence of Arabia about? Lawrence of Arabia is the story of a man who discovers that the trick is the trick that the idea of not minding that it hurts is not sustainable. Okay, so it's about a man who thinks the trick is not minding that it hurts. He can do things as long as he ignores his reactions to them, his humanity. If he denies himself in the things that he does, he'll be able to achieve great things, and eventually discovers that you can't deny yourself. Eventually, you have to face up to yourself. And so, again, Lawrence of Arabia is the story of a man who discovers that eventually you will mind that it hurts. That statement is a story that has a statement that has implicitly within it movement. Okay, so whatever your statement is, it has to have this idea of movement.
So how does that kind of thematic logline connect to the story synopsis? How do you use your thematic logline to help you build a story synopsis?
So I now need, in my story synopsis document, to describe the events of the story in such a way that they obey, as it were, the structure of that one sentence. Okay, so what I'm saying is, it's the story of one man's quest to reconcile conflicting opposites. So the key idea in this thematic statement is the reconciliation of opposites. Okay, so now I take the plot events of the of Witness, of the story, and I have to describe them in terms of the reconciliation of opposites. And this is where it gets precise and technical. Okay, so you take my log line and expand it a little. Okay, and I'm going to expand it a little because I want to describe it more precisely, and I want to describe it more precisely in terms of the reconciliation of conflicting opposites. Okay, because that's my thematic center. What I'm saying is, what the story is really about is a man's quest to reconcile conflicting opposites. If that's true, then I should be able to describe the story, the plot, in terms of those, and it not feel weird, not sound like it's going off track. That's not really right. See what I mean?
Yeah.
So and then you will see what happens when you do this, because you start to warp the language. It becomes slightly exaggerated. Now I'm exaggerating it more even than normal because, again, for purpose of illustration, I want to make it clear. Okay, so here's, we went back to that log line. Remember the log line that we had, which was...
John Book, a good cop, must protect a young Amish boy who has witnessed a murder. He retreats with the boy to Amish country, where he has to adjust to life with the Amish and his feelings for the boy's mother. John Book's relationship with the Amish allows him to defeat the killers when they arrive. But once his work is done, he must leave his new life and the mother behind.
Okay, now we're going to describe the earlier parts of that log line in terms of the reconciliation of opposites. And I'm going to exaggerate it slightly for effect in order to make it really clear. Here goes.
John Book, a gun-toting, fast-acting modern-day cop, is forced to bury himself within the non-violent, slow-moving, archaic society of the Amish in order to protect an innocent boy.
Okay, so look at how that sentence is written. Gun-toting contrasts with non-violent. Fast-acting contrasts with slow-moving. Modern-day, contrasts with archaic. So I'm writing a sentence which has in the first half a description of three things: gun-toting, fast-acting, modern-day. And in the second half of the sentence, they're opposites: non-violent, slow-moving, archaic. The thematic idea of the story is the reconciliation of opposites. So the first thing we have to do in the statement of the events of the story, in order to illustrate the theme, is lay out what those opposites are. Okay, we're not reconciling them yet because it's the beginning. The opposites in this story are not going to be reconciled until the end. Okay, so the beginning part of the story is where you lay out the opposites. The middle part of the story is where those opposites come into conflict, and the end part of the story is where there's that conflict between the opposites is going to be reconciled. So when you write your description of the plot, you're going to lay out the conflict. The middle section of the description of the plot is going to show how those conflicts weave into each other, and the third part of the description of the plot is going to show how they're reconciled. See what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's what you get is a kind of clumsy to read description of the story. That's not a problem. This document is not there. You're not going to show this document to anyone else.
Okay, so this is an absolutely internal in development.
Absolutely internal development. It's for you to kind of explore the theme. Now, if you say, okay, I know what the theme is at the beginning, but if when you get to the middle section, you simply can't do this at all. What that's pointing you to probably is the fact that thematically your story isn't clear in the middle. The reason you can't do it, it's easy to do. It's always easier to do on finished work because they've, the makers of this work, this Witness, have, they spent literally years working all this out and making these things fit and work and play into each other. when you're developing, these things are still half formed. So you're going to find sections where you think, okay, I can do that in the first paragraph quite easily. But when I get to my second paragraph, I'm a bit lost. I can't see what's going on. And then you need to step back and go, okay, well, the answer to that is probably not, or may not be. You simply can't write it in this exercise of writing a story synopsis. You can't do it because you haven't done it in the script. This is pointing you to the fact that thematically your story is underdeveloped. Your theme is not clearly articulated and developing through the story. So maybe rather than say, I'm going to have another go at making that work, you need to step back from the writing of the story synopsis and think about the way your story develops in that section that you can't write a sentence about. Because it may well be sending you back, saying, okay, you need to work out what the development of the theme is through this section. Because the reason you can't write a sentence about it is because you haven't got it. It's not there. So looking at Book, we describe him at the beginning then in relation to the theme. We're describing him as a bundle of opposites. He's all these modern things that he's going to be conflict. He's going to be sent in this world where these kind of opposites. Then we move into the middle of the story. Okay.
John Book finds himself falling for the mother of the boy he is trying to protect. As his love for her develops, he is powerless to stop the killers destroying his cop partner. When the moment comes that Book cannot keep up his facade, because he must protect the Amish the only way he knows how, his actions bring the killers into the community.
Okay, so this is where the opposites in the story start to interweave and start to confuse, start to mash into each other. Book finds himself falling for the mother of the boy he is trying to protect. That's not an explicit opposite, but there's a kind of tension in there. Falling for the mother of the boy he's trying to protect is getting in the way of being able to protect the boy. It's a complication, and it's kind of not exactly the opposite, but it's pretty much. He's supposedly a protector of the innocent boy, but he is drawn more and more to the mother, which is pulling him away. So there's a tension and there's kind of opposition in the character there between, as it were, protection, and which is to say something that you do for someone else, and love and fascination and desire, which is something that you feel for someone else. So there are conflicting, not exactly opposites, but oppositional, if you like, forces at work with Book. His desire to protect and his desire, if you like. So that within the character himself, it's about these tensions, these opposites at play. As his love for her develops, he is powerless to stop the killers destroying his cop partner. So as there's a whole section in the middle of the story which is really about John Book and the Amish and falling into the Amish way of life, and his adjustment to that, and his increasing desire and fascination with the mother, and it's pulling him away from being a cop. Meanwhile, his partner, who's back in the cop world, is killed by the bad guys, and Book has withdrawn, as it were, from the world of action. And he's withdrawn from the world of action voluntarily because he's fascinated by this life, and in particular by this woman. And because he's fascinated by her and is falling into his own emotional world in relation to her, he's going into the world of emotion and leaving, or the world of character, and leaving behind the world of action. And as he leaves the world of action behind, his partner is killed. And there's a relationship. What he thinks after his partner is killed is, if I had been there, that wouldn't have happened. If I had been more alert to what was going on, that wouldn't have happened. I'm responsible. And again, that's the opposites at play with him. You could just equally say yes, but if you had been there for your partner, you would never have felt this intensity of love that you've never felt before. You would never have felt an affection for this landscape and this people, which is making you question the life choices you've already made in your life. So there's a trade-off. There's always these opposite forces are at play in the character. It gives the middle its kind of complex tensions that make this film really interesting and enjoyable for the audience. It's thematic. It's the interplay of these thematic ideas.
Because it focuses it shows those dramatic tensions through character relationships. So it's being dramatized,
which is something that, Stu, you and I had trouble with our recent projects. Like, we wrote out a very solid story and had all the characters and all the character motivations, and it was only when we got to the second draft where we're like, does this accurately dramatize what we're trying to say? And we went back into it.
Yes, it always relates, of course, to plot and character. So this thematic idea of you have a man who's being pulled in more than one direction, you then say, okay, well, how does the plot manifest that being pulled in more and more one direction. Which is, and the answer is because there are two plot worlds. There's a cop plot world, and there's the Amish, domestic plot world. And that being pulled between two worlds, we have to dramatize both worlds. So that there's a job of the writer to dramatize the world, populate those worlds with characters, unique characters. So his cop partner is a unique character in the cop world, doesn't come into the Amish world. The Amish mother is a unique character in the Amish world, doesn't come into the cop world. And he's caught in the middle. These opposite tensions, these oppositions are pulling on him from both sides. And each of those oppositional worlds has its own plot and its own character development. So implicit in this thematic idea is all the dramatization work that you have to do. It's not, knowing the theme this way doesn't mean the work's done. There's still lots of real work to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When the moment comes that Book cannot keep up his facade because he must protect the Amish the only way he knows how, his actions bring the killers into the community.
If you remember in the film, what happens to bring the bad guys from the city into the country, again, that opposition of city and country, is another. This film is nothing but oppositions. If you look at it through the lens of kind of oppositional reconciliation, what brings the city into the country is, if you remember, there are some tourists, and this tourist, this kind of rednecky tourist, wipes an ice cream in the face of the Amish man. The Amish man doesn't react. He's very stoic.
Good chin, yeah. You look better, buddy.
What's next, guy?
Come on down, Jack.
Hey, they're not allowed to fight, Frank.
You a man or what?
Yeah, that's right. No fighting. They won't fight for their country either.
It's not our way.
But it's my way.
No!
And John Book is there, and then the guy tries something on with John Book, and he made a mistake because, the Amish are naturally what they are.
You're making a mistake.
Hey.
Boom.
John Book is a man with, he's dressed as an Amish, but he's not a man. And this guy does something to John Book. And John Book beats the shit out of him. So his action is not he's dressed as an Amish, but his action is a city. He's a city man disguised as an Amish. These tensions within him. He's literally wearing the uniform of the country, but inside him, he's a city cop. When the guy does something to him, John Book belts him. That inability to maintain the tension within him, that inability to be a city man disguised as an Amish. He's got these two things. His inability to sit happily between the two means that when the guy attacks him, he beats the guy up. And because he beats the guy up, the cops who are watching, who are looking out for where John Book has gone, realized that man was not an Amish man. That's John Book. So his natural reaction to protect the Amish, and the only way he can protect the Amish is by violence, because he's a man of violence. That natural reaction to protect the Amish brings the killers to him. And this is, again, it's a wonderful opposition. His instinct is to protect, and the consequence of his instinct to protect is he brings the community into more danger than it has ever been before. Okay, it's the opposite effect. This is in the middle of the story where, these oppositional forces are at play. When you do one thing, what you get is the opposite. What he wants to do is protect them. The result is a bunch of guys with guns drive into the community. And he's brought it on himself. So now these tensions, these opposites, this is the middle, the end of the middle. All these tensions and the oppositions are now banging into each other. And the question now is, how are they going to be reconciled? So we write the third part of our story synopsis.
To defeat the killers, Book must bring violence into the community which has saved him and risks destroying the community's cohesion in the process. And if he is to be successful in destroying the men of violence, he will have to set into play a series of events which will mean he has to lose that which he now holds dearest, the mother and her boy.
So this is the end of the story, the conclusion part of the story. It's the reconciliation of opposites. If he's going to defeat the killers and end the story, save the boy, then rather than live forever in this community with the boy, the day of reckoning will come. And that moment of beating up the Amish, the man who attacked the Amish that we just talked about, is the triggering event that brings the men of violence into the community, which in some sense is everything that he doesn't want, but it's what he has to do. Again, it's reconciliation of opposite. If this is ever going to end, then there's going to have to be a confrontation. So that accidental exposure of himself, in fact, is probably the best thing he could have done, because one way or another, eventually there's going to have to be a reckoning. and so he brings the reckoning on. And these people arrive into the community, and this is the critical moment where these oppositions are now out in the open, and the community is at complete risk, and he may destroy everything. Okay, if he is going to be successful in destroying the men of violence, he then has to set into play a series of events that will mean he loses those things which he holds dearest now. Well, first of all, in the scenes where the men of violence come into the community, some men of violence are shown to be defeated by the confrontation with the non-modern. There's one man, if you remember, is drowned in a grain silo. He's killed by his lack of understanding of a non-technological advanced society. He doesn't understand where he's going in the grain silo. He doesn't understand the danger he's in. So these men come into a world that they don't understand, which is the opposite from what they've known, and that opposition can be used to destroy them. But finally, in a kind of critical moment, what happens is that Book is cornered by the guy who wants to kill him, his ex-boss. Again, there's an opposition there, a reconciliation. It's the employee and the boss are in the final confrontation. And if you remember, the bell is rung, and all the Amish farmers run from all over, and the guy has a gun, and they're surrounded by like 30 Amish farmers in a circle. And John Book says to him,
"What are you going to do, Paul? You going to kill me? You going to shoot me? You going to shoot him? Stand back! You going to shoot him? Is that what you're going to do, Paul? Him, the woman, me? It's over. Enough! Enough!"
And the man of violence is destroyed by non-violence. Is defeated by non-violence. The man realizes that he's got a gun and he can kill 3 or 4 of them, but he's still going to get caught. He's still not going to get away with it. So there's no point in killing John Book because he's going to get caught anyway. So the mere physical presence of the Amish is enough to destroy the defeat the kind of man of violence. But in that moment, in that defeat, John Book knows that what that proves to all the people there is that John Book cannot stay in that community.
Yeah, he can't integrate.
Because he's going to be because this will happen again. Because if you bring a man of violence and modernity into this world, this world cannot, the world cannot sustain, cannot keep that man of violence within it, because more violence will follow. The modern world will come swarming into this world again and again and again. So by saving the community, and by cementing his value to the community, John Book has created a set of conditions which means he can never stay in this community again. By expressing his love for these people, in particular his love for the family that he's become part of, John Book has excluded himself from that family forever. So you see what I mean? It's about, again, this conflict and confrontation of opposites. The reconciliation is internal. John Book, when we see John Book come into the film, he's a loner, he has a brief scene with his sister where she talks about him never settling down, and how come you always come around to my house and hang out with my kids, and what she's kind of saying to him is, you need kids of your own, you need a life of your own, you need to take care of your own emotional inner needs. And Book is like, oh, well, I don't want to do that, and he's kind of typical blunt, whatever. He goes to this community and there's a mother, and he falls desperately for the mother, and he becomes a father to the boy. Exactly what his sister had said to him in the city before he went there. You need to pay attention to your inner life. What really matters is not your job, not constantly being at work, which is what you always are, not being the best cop. You need to pay attention to other things. He's thrown into a world, through this story of action, he's thrown into a world of domestic happiness. And he's given the chance to understand what it means to be emotionally fulfilled. And by the emotions that arise in him because of that experience, to generate a set of circumstances by which he can never stay in a place where he can be most happy. So it's, again, the oppositions. But there is a reconciliation, because when John Book walks out of that film, we no longer feel that there is no future for this man emotionally. The opposites are reconciled within him. He is, as it were, he's not got what he wants in the external world, but he's got what he wants internally. He's been changed. And when he walks out of that life, we know that somewhere out there in the world is a person for him. Somewhere out there in the world is someone he can love and who will love him, because now he knows how important it is. So those opposites, the reconciliation is within the character. We know he's resolved as a character. It was unresolved when he came into the story. He's resolved as he leaves it. And the resolution has become through this play of the oppositions throughout the story. The whole story has been about, as it were, will John Book reconcile the oppositions within him? His desire to be a man of law and order, his desire to love and be loved. They look like they're oppositions, but in fact, through his love and desire for this woman and this boy, he is able to reconcile, as it were, the conflicting tension within himself. So all of this kind of conflicting, oppositional storytelling is to the service of the reconciliation of the seemingly irreconcilable within the character. How can this detective serve justice and the American way of life, and yet think about himself, his internal happiness? And the answer is yes, he can. He's kind of, if you like, your classic noir detective at the beginning, and he's a normal person at the end. He's been taken away from.
Would you use that kind of terminology in your story synopsis? The way that you've kind of talked about it, that this happens and, the man of violence is confronted by the non-violence of the people standing.
Yes, I would. I mean, I would write it, if that's the thematic idea that works, that holds, I would write it as boldly as possible. So every time to be as explicit as possible in every sentence to say, look, there's a theme, look, there's the theme, look, there's the theme, exhaustively. So when you've finished this document, it should only be a page and a half.
Okay.
It doesn't need to be any longer than that. You have, moment by moment through the story, explored the expression of the theme and the action of the story.
Let's just go through the whole story synopsis as one chunk now that we've kind of broken down how to write it kind of section by section. Let's just hear it.
John Book, a gun-toting, fast-acting modern-day cop, is forced to bury himself within the non-violent, slow-moving, archaic society of the Amish in order to protect an innocent boy. John Book finds himself falling for the mother of the boy he is trying to protect. As his love for her develops, he is powerless to stop the killers destroying his cop partner. When the moment comes that Book cannot keep up his facade because he must protect the Amish the only way he knows how, his actions bring the killers into the community. To defeat the killers, Book must bring violence into the community which has saved him and risk destroying the community's cohesion in the process. And if he is to be successful in destroying the men of violence, he will have to set into play a series of events which will mean he has to lose that which he now holds dearest, the mother and her boy.
Yeah.
So the way you're talking about the ideal sort of development process is you've written like a series of documents that have helped you break down a plot, like a story, Praxis, and then you could have written that. You've written a treatment or an outline, and then you could just immediately open up another window and start rewriting that story, but only from the point of view of theme.
Absolutely.
Through, God, what was it? Mythos?
Yes. Absolutely. And the reason for it, and it's, as I say, it's an ugly thing to read, but it's kind of ugly beautiful. If you've got it right, you go, well, my theme develops. I see how I'm developing it. I see, and if it doesn't work in certain sections, there's going to be bits where you go, I can't. It doesn't seem to flow as easily. I can write. It seems to work quite easily through these 4 or 5 lines, and I get to these 3 lines, and I can't kind of get it. It doesn't, and that's I'd say, that means go back and look at that part of the story, because maybe what's happening there is that your theme isn't really clearly expressed. It's been working really well, and then it kind of becomes a bit mushy. And so the action, the scenes you've chosen to show, and what you're showing there is maybe the problem. It may not be that you can't nail it for yourself. And it pushes you to that understanding of the theme, so that as once you then get familiar with, when you come to write the thing, thematically what the thematic development is. You've thought it through for yourself. What you need is always that initial thematic idea.
But what if you don't have an initial thematic idea? I mean, Chaz and I know, probably on the exception, we tend to start with more of a thematic idea of what we're trying to say and then work backwards from that, but not always. Our next project is kind of, I guess you'd describe it as The Purge meets Macbeth. I don't know. It's kind of more of a concept of a story or a type of story rather than something that's driven by a theme. And I think a lot of writers start with that. They kind of start with a character, or they start with a setting or a world or an event, and they don't really quite know what their theme is.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like with our last project, we knew areas of theme that we wanted to explore, but it was only after we'd written the screenplay, and frankly, 2 versions of the screenplay, that I think we could firmly put our finger on, this story is now about this and this.
Or perhaps putting it more into that sense of forward movement that Stephen talked about at the beginning. Like, we had a thematic area that we wanted to look at, but we had to kind of do more work on how that kind of transformed.
Yeah, but it was also
time,
interesting
maybe?
in that we did our second pass looking at the main character motivations from a thematic point of view. It's like how we know the actions we want them to take, and what wasn't quite working was why they did them. And we wanted to make sure that the why the characters did things aligned with the themes that we were expressing. But yeah, a lot of the projects that we kick around, we nearly always start very either high concept or very plot driven without a ton of theme early on.
Look, I don't know if I disagree with you on that. I mean, I think there is kind of broadly speaking like a thematic area, which isn't always where writers start. It's not, to be honest, it's not always where I start. Like there's a reason that you can draw into something, but sometimes it can be concept or character or location or an event. Everyone every project, not just every writer, but every project kind of has a different starting point, I guess.
And I think it would also be fair to say that while I always know kind of the theme going into a project, it's more like you said earlier, it's a thematic area, and a clearer theme comes out to me only after I've written at least one draft of the screenplay.
The thing about the theme that makes things difficult is that quite often for writers, it takes quite a long time for the theme to become clear. You don't have to know the theme before you write a screenplay. If you do, it's great. You think, I know what it's really about. Sometimes you don't, or sometimes more often you think it's about this, and then you finish a screenplay and you give it to someone else and they go, yeah, it's really great. It's all about this. And you kind of go, what? And then you go, well, yeah, I can see, wow. Yeah, kind of. Maybe that is what it's about. Maybe my idea of a theme is not actually, there was always within me a different theme that I was pushing and exploring. If you're a writer who's written a number of screenplays, you will probably find that irrespective of the action of the screenplays, the thematic ideas you're exploring tend to be very similar. And the stories may be wildly different, but writers tend to explore the same kind of thematic ideas over the body of work they do. Writers don't have, if you've written 10 screenplays, you're probably, I would say almost certainly not exploring 10 different thematic ideas. I think more likely you're exploring 2 thematic ideas over and over again. Because the thing that generates, as it were, the theme is within the writer, and it's to do with unreconciled issues within the person themselves, within you as a person. That's where it comes from,
That explains a lot about Chaz.
This document, if you're writing it, for example, after you've written your first treatment but you haven't written the story yet, is partly a kind of self-exploration. It's what's my story really about? What am I really trying to do? And this is why this document again can be quite tricky and difficult, but it's definitely worth when you think you've hit what the theme is, and you can write that first sentence. The reconciliation of one man's quest to reconcile conflicting opposites in his life. Once you've nailed a statement like that, that's what my story is really about. Then, and you can take your story through that kind of this writing process in terms of that kind of theme. It can be really, really useful. Really kind of.
And I think it can also potentially be used as a rewriting tool. Yeah. Like I've got particularly like from a first draft into a second draft, but even later on where you go, I'm going to take that, boil down, try to retell the story thematically.
Yeah, 100%. This is how I see this document actually working better for me in my process. I mean, look, I will probably use one in the first draft of something now that I think about it. And I think it will also influence how I write sales documents, which we'll get into in a little bit.
Or even, I find it interesting. I think it could be used by directors as well, picking up a script that you haven't written and trying to get your head into the thematics. And, I could even say, but potentially doing a kind of a forensic analysis of the scene, writing the events of the scene, the beats of the scene in a thematic thing. But it's interesting that you pull out these big pictures and it's helping you reinforce the image system, being surrounded by the Amish, dying in the grain, that's helping you reinforce some of that image system stuff that might help with rewrites or staging or any of that stuff. It's really cool. I've never heard of this before. So
if you're a director of someone else's work, the fact that this is kind of an interesting kind of question is to what extent are your loyalties as a director? To what extent do you owe an obligation to the original writer to stay true to their thematic center. I think you can get into trouble if you ignore it and you go, okay, but as a director, for example, or indeed as a writer who's brought onto a project which you didn't originate, but someone may bring you on as a writer. The question is, okay, as a writer, as a director, there are themes which, if you look at the body of my work, and this is true, I think, of most writers, most directors, there are recurrent themes in the work that I do. I'm drawn to material that allows me to explore certain ideas, and I don't think any director would deny that. There's certain things they enjoy, and so, they're drawn to something they're not. And the question is, well, why are you drawn to it? And it's not just, it's a really nicely written script, because there are lots of really nicely written scripts. It's what specifically about the material speaks to you. And when we say the material speaks to me, what you kind of mean is thematically I can find myself in this material. So then there's the question, to what extent, as the director coming onto someone else's screenplay, do you have an obligation to be truthful to their theme? Because you can't deny the thematic center of yourself. If you say, well, my job is, as it were, to illustrate on behalf of the writer the themes they're interested in. Can you really do that? Or are you going to be bringing yourself, whether you like it or not, to the material? So there's a kind of balance, and I think it's an interesting question. I don't have a particular answer for it. I think the same is true with rewriting. There are thematic ideas that you will always be drawn to as a writer, which is why you will write the kinds of things that you write.
What about and Chaz and I both have experience with this, doing rewrites on other people's scripts, or kind of like a collaboration where someone has come to you with the basis of an idea. So it's not like a joint genesis, but more like, either a rewrite or developing someone else's, like a producer's treatment, or that might be a generous word.
To be fair, in my one single experience of this, the producer came to me with a character and a concept with zero theme. So I had the space to bring my own theme.
If you are given someone else's script to rewrite, okay, if you say, well, in order to rewrite this, I have to deny everything about myself in order to do simply a technical rewriting job on this screenplay, and I mustn't interfere with the original thematic ideas and the thematic center of this story. My suspicion was, if you do that, what you will do is a piece of cold technical writing, because your heart literally isn't in it. So you always have to, when you're brought onto a new screenplay to rewrite, I think you have to look at the screenplay and try and work out what you think the thematic center of the story is, and then say to yourself, is that the thematic center I'm interested in? Or is there another idea within this material, another thematic that I want to develop further and take in a different way? And if there is, and there very often is, then, you need to start discussing that with the people you're working with. Because if you're brought on as a new writer, then presumably there's a producer, maybe a director in the background. So that discussion about what's the thematic of the original, what we're starting with, and where might we go with it, has to become put on the table. And as the writer, the rewriter, as it were, the next writer, part of your job, I think, is to look at the thematic idea in the original, look at the thematic ideas you're interested in, and say, look, I think I want to bring this. Or what would happen if can we do this? What do we think? And have a discussion about that. Because you don't want to be delivering something which is either a half-hearted attempt by yourself not to get thematically involved, or a wholehearted re-evaluation of the story in terms of your thematic, which no one else has been told about before you started. And then you then give them a script and they go, well, it's a really nicely written script, but it's not the script we wanted. And that happens in rewriting all the time. The producer goes, yeah, it's great, but it's not what I wanted. And then the question is, well, how come you got that far? Ultimately, for me, this is always the responsibility of the producer. It's your job to get these discussions open and to as it were, keep the development on the right track. But, somewhere along the line, that thematic discussion has not been had. And so you're all in a bit of a mess, because, you either have to backtrack or, you're in trouble. So that question of a thematic. So as a writer coming onto a project, for example, I would say writing a story synopsis like this of the material that you're coming onto, not putting yourself into it, but trying to nail the theme for yourself in the material you've got, is a very useful thing to do early on. Because then you can say to your producer and whatever, look, I've been looking at the material, I think thematically, this isn't what the story's really about. The story that you have that you're not happy with. Okay, so can we talk about the theme and have that discussion and get somewhere with that discussion, before you go too far down the line with the writing?
It kind of becomes a dress rehearsal for that discussion. It's giving you the terminology, it's letting you nut it out, so you can have that conversation. I think naturally by trying to write this document, it's going through a bit of interpretive process anyway, so probably somewhat aligning with your sensibilities anyway, and then you can kind of have a kind of more productive or overt discussion about theme, as opposed to being something that people feel like is a difficult thing to talk about and don't talk about.
Yeah,
it's pretty easy, or kind of speaking in grand terms. Oh, it's a quest for this, but understanding the mechanics.
And not just the mechanics, it helps you say, this is what this story is about in really clear terms. This is what I want you to feel and experience and ponder.
Absolutely. And the thing about, this document in particular is that people talk about theme in relation to development and stories all the time, talk about the theme of the story. It's a very common phrase, very common term that's used. We talk about the themes and ideas of a story or whatever. But in all the kind of short documents that we talk about and all the development processes we talk about, you would never ever say, okay, is there a specific place where we can sit down and literally think about a theme document? You talk about plot all the time. There's loads of plot documents. Talk about character. There's loads of character documents. So let's do a character background. Let's have the character write a letter. Let's have the character. Let's fill in the Kinsey report survey in character. There's thousands of different ways of exploring character in documents. There's thousands of different ways of exploring plot and things. But this really central idea to a story theme, you say to someone, okay, what are the story documents that you use that only really concentrate on theme? It's kind of like, there aren't any, apart from, I think my theme is. And so this is a document that allows you to explore theme, and it's going to be clumsy and difficult, and it's going to be awkward to write, and it's going to be awkward to read, because the theme is kind of, what we're talking about now is a theme that's kind of partially developed. It's not in the development process. We're not there yet. The film is not finished. The idea is not finished. So these things are not going to be. It's not going to be complete. It's not going to be a wonderful reading experience, but it's going to take you into the area you need to be thinking about. Why I think it's so important. So
ending these sections on kind of development documents before we move on to talking about like sales document, do you think there's any that are kind of, for lack of a better word, essential?
As I say, for me, if you take in short documents, this is one of the documents that you have to do. There are documents that are on that list we talked about that, you can choose to do and, take you in different directions. For me, if you take what in development are the documents that you're going to have to do, I would say this and the step outline. Where you're beating out the scenes, as it were, through your story, you have to do at some point in the writing of the screenplay. You can get away even without writing a treatment in certain circumstances. If someone just loves your writing and says, okay, I want you to write a screenplay for me, and we're going to commission you to write out this book, and if the producer's absolutely confident in you and they've got the money to pay you, then you don't necessarily have to write a treatment because you're not selling it at that point. So you could get through the process of development there by using story synopsis, some notes and a step outline. You wouldn't necessarily have to write a treatment. There wouldn't be any necessity to do that. But even in that process where the money isn't an object, so you don't have to go out and sell the thing, I think this document is vital. And if you are going to write a treatment, I think this document is really vital, because I think it shows you the unfolding of the theme, and that's something you want to refer to when you're when you write your treatment document. You go, okay, how does a theme work through the middle of the story? Oh yeah, I've got a document that kind of shows me a little bit how that's working. So I think it's a really important document. And they are, as I say, they're clumsy and awkward documents. They don't read well. That's not necessarily a problem. You're as in our witness example, we are exaggerating the thematic in order to pull it out of the massive story that we've got. So don't expect.
Go back to the gym metaphor to wrap up this section. It's like not every piece of equipment is going to make you look graceful.
Absolutely.
If you're isolating something, it's being ugly and awkward means you're working that muscle particularly.
It's the kind of cross trainer, where you're kind of lurching and whatever, but actually it's actually doing you all sorts of good in all sorts of different ways.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks, Stephen, for clarifying that. That actually wasn't really what I had a feeling about, so I think that ended up being really valuable to do in such forensic detail. Awesome. Thanks so much, Stephen.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
And look forward to part 3 of this short document series, where Stephen goes into how to write short documents differently when they are not for the purpose of you developing your screenplay, but rather to get people to feel the experience and excitement of your screenplay so that they want to actually read your screenplay.
Or commission you to write your screenplay or give you development money.
I.e. selling documents.
Because we're often selling our projects right from the very beginning.
Thank you very much to our patrons who made this and much more Draft Zero possible. Thanks to Chris Walker, Jack Smith, Jesse Laurie, Crob Edmonds, Matteo Bernardini, Nick MacArthur, Sandra Willis, and Theus Bergstrom.
If you feel so compelled to argue with Chaz and myself about anything on this episode or anything in general, you can find many ways to contact us at draft-zero.com.
And there you will also find the show notes for this episode, as well as links to
share the word and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts.
And if you're feeling even more supportive, you can also find links to our Patreon page.
Here's a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing.